Hello everyone and welcome back to Anomalous Archive, where we post scary stories to help you sleep. Please comment where you are listening to my videos from, since I believe it would be fun for all of us to know. Also, please don't forget to like and subscribe. Thank you for helping me reach to 50 subscribers. Let's reach 100 subscribers before the end of January. So sit back, relax and enjoy. Father was always a big man, inclined to gain weight, but his work had kept him fit since his youth. For his entire life, he worked on the railroad, coupling and uncoupling train cars, constantly walking from one place to another during each shift. That's why his body stayed moderate in size, strong arms, powerful legs, and a slightly protruding belly. He was like a whale, a circus strongman. Father always said that work was his remedy for all troubles. But those troubles caught up with him when it was time to retire. At first, my old man didn't seem too upset. On the contrary, he said he would finally have time to do something interesting. He always admired my love for reading and said he wanted to take up books too. However, when the opportunity came, Father admitted it wasn't all that engaging. His eyes quickly grew tired. Then Dad seriously took to overeating, and I didn't immediately notice how much and how often he was eating. We lived together, but spent most of our time in our own rooms and rarely bothered each other. It was only a month ago that I noticed how much he had changed. His usual plaid shirt, which used to fit loosely, was now stretched tight over his plumper body. It seemed like the buttons were on the verge of popping off. Father's face had rounded out, and his cheeks looked like two fried pastries. The fridge emptied quickly, and the trash bin filled to the brim every day. He was eating something every time I came home. One evening, I peeked into his room and found him devouring a large chocolate cake, not sliced into pieces, but scooping it out with a spoon as if it were porridge, while noisily sipping tea. "Dad, sorry for saying this, but I think you're eating too much," I said. He lifted his hazy gaze and said, "I know, but I can't think of another way to distract myself from my thoughts." "What thoughts?" I asked. That's when he opened up to me. It turned out that while he was busy with work, he didn't think about anything except his tasks. But now, he was reflecting on everything at once, the past, the future, and the present, in which practically nothing was happening. Even when Father just sat in his chair staring at the wall, his mind was running at full throttle. I can't stop thinking. I look at the wallpaper and see how the lines intertwine, forming various patterns, and I think, he muttered as if talking to himself. Why do the lines intertwine like that? Why not differently? What difference does it make what the pattern is? But it could have been another way. I didn't understand what he meant. To me, it was just wallpaper, but for him, it was some kind of spectacle that made him ponder its infinite variations and simultaneously the futility of his thoughts. Loud voices came from upstairs. The neighbors had started an argument, and Father immediately began musing aloud. Why are they arguing like that? Why can't they live peacefully? I was irritated, so I answered harshly, "Dad, there are two of them, and you can't even get along with yourself." Father replied, "You're right. Yes, I can't live with myself, in my own head." It seemed that he, always immersed in work, simply hadn't learned to control his mind in moments of solitude. He had never had such an opportunity in his entire life. A fly buzzed into the room. Father grabbed a fly swatter, waited for the insect to land on the table, and swatted it. "Why do they waste their energy so aimlessly?" my old man said, looking at the dead fly. "What's the point?" It just flew around for no reason, tracing circles in the room. "Why?" "It has no goal, no purpose, nothing." I didn't know how to respond. There wasn't just sadness in his eyes, but some deep despair. He couldn't sit alone with his thoughts. They tormented him and gave him no peace. I've never in my life thought about killing flies just because they annoy me, he said, placing the fly swatter on the nightstand. But why am I thinking about this now? It's just endless nonsense in my head. That's why Father tried to occupy himself with anything, resorting to eating to drown out his oppressive thoughts. He returned from the store hauling huge bags stuffed with food, sausage, cheese, bread, pastries, dumplings, pierogi, mayonnaise, sour cream, chocolate, canned goods, chips, soda, meat, and more. Dad would grab anything he saw on the shelves, bring it home, and eat almost everything at once. He ate even while talking, stirring thick soup in a pot and shoving processed cheese into his mouth. One piece slipped from his slippery fingers and plopped right onto the floor. Dad, don't tell me you're going to eat that. I stopped him as he picked it up and was about to put it in his mouth. It's covered in dust, look at it. Father turned the piece over in his hand and carefully inspected it. Then that's the dust problem, he said, and popped the cheese into his mouth without brushing it off. Disgusting, I mumbled and went back to my room. Over time, it became something permanent. In the kitchen, something was always bubbling and sizzling. He loved greasy food, frying pork until it smoked, and cooking potatoes by pouring almost half a bottle of oil into the pan. When he ate, fat dripped down his face and hands, but Dad didn't pay any attention to it, smacking his lips as he chewed until the last piece was gone. Then he would lick the dishes clean, afraid to waste a single drop of food. Dad ate in the kitchen and in his room. Plates piled high with food stood in front of him, pasta, sausages, cutlets generously smothered in mayonnaise and ketchup. All of it he would shove into his mouth, swallowing without chewing properly, and washing it down with soda, leaving greasy fingerprints on the neck of the bottle. Fats and sauces dripped from his mouth, down his chin, and onto his shirt. Dad would slurp and lick his lips, wiping them with his clothes or his fingers. I couldn't help but feel disgusted with him, but at the same time, I pitied him. Dad was like a prisoner of his insatiable greed, which consumed him, and he couldn't overcome it. The house became stuffy, reeking of grease and sourness, and it was impossible to air it out. The smells had seeped into the furniture and walls. Grease stains appeared on the tiles above the stove, impossible to scrub off even with the strongest chemicals. My friends used to visit me, but I stopped inviting them. I was ashamed of what was happening in my house. Dad kept gaining weight, his body swelled, and his face became unrecognizable. His shirts wouldn't even button anymore. Lately, he often walked around with his belly exposed, and when food dripped onto his hairy stomach, he would deftly swipe the drop with his fingers and put it back in his mouth. I could no longer eat with him in the same kitchen because the sight made me gag. One day, I remembered a childhood taunt and said to him, "Dad, you've gotten so fat, like a passenger train." He replied, "No one says that. A train can only be passenger, not passenger-like." Ah, if only he hadn't left his trains, if only he had worked instead of spending all his pension on food. He developed shortness of breath and started moving with difficulty. Dad only left the house to go to the nearby store. All he did was eat. He ate non-stop, ate until he felt sick, ate until he fell asleep with a chicken bone in his hand, smearing grease on the couch upholstery and pillowcases. Of course, Dad knew his condition was awful. He often said he couldn't live like this anymore, but he couldn't stop. I decided to help him, telling him we needed to change his eating habits, eat fewer carbs, more protein, and move more, go for walks. Dad agreed to the diet but lasted exactly 2 days. I cooked for the two of us. He didn't like eating plain cottage cheese, boiled eggs, or meat without sauce. "Everything is bland, tasteless, no joy in it," he said irritably. By the first hours of the diet, he became irritable, talking to me as if I were an enemy standing between him and a kilogram of ham. On the evening of the second day, Dad came into my room. "Where's dinner?" he asked. "I feel heavy-hearted," I replied, noticing beads of sweat on his forehead. I put my book down, looked at the clock, and said, "I'll cook now." "I can't wait that long," Dad yelled, his eyes bulging. His face turned crimson. He stomped into the kitchen like an elephant, and I hurried after him. "Dad, calm down, there's nothing ready anyway." This didn't stop him. He opened the fridge and started grabbing everything. He poured several raw eggs straight into his throat. One yolk splattered on the floor. Then Dad pulled out a raw chicken and began tearing it apart with his teeth. He could barely stand. Foam started coming out of his mouth. He chewed the meat with the skin like a savage and washed it down with sunflower oil. At that moment, I realized it was much worse than I initially thought. This wasn't just stress or a minor mental disorder, it was a severe illness. He needed professional help, not my diet plan. I didn't know what to do. I distanced myself from him and let him live as he wanted. I didn't even go into his room or talk to him. What could I do? People are forcibly sent to psychiatrists only if they're violent, and Dad only attacked food. It didn't bother anyone but me. Dad kept gorging himself. He became so heavy that he could barely move. The old parquet floor creaked under his steps. His body, once round, became lumpy and flabby. Fat folds hung out from under his smelly, stained t-shirt. I had to visit several plus-size stores, but even there, they joked that it would be easier to cut 3 holes in a parachute. In the end, I had to have clothes custom made at a local tailor shop. Eventually, my father completely stopped leaving the house and began ordering food directly to the apartment. I dreaded imagining what would happen when he could no longer move at all. I would have to take care of him and wash that mountain of folds. Horrifying. At night, it was impossible to sleep. It felt like the walls were shaking from his snoring. And he didn't want to hear about treatment. He would say, "Do you think I'm crazy or something? Why would I need a clinic?" I didn't even notice how I began to hate him for what he was doing to himself and for simultaneously ruining my life. This was no longer my father, but some kind of insane, gluttonous monster. The day came when Dad called me for help. He couldn't get up from the couch on his own. I walked into his room. Trash was strewn everywhere, empty bags, cardboard boxes from sandwiches and fries, soda bottles. And there was my dad sprawled on the couch, unable to muster the strength to push himself up. He had gained so much weight that he no longer resembled a human being. In the narrow slits, you could barely make out his eyes. I came closer and saw that hard, cone-shaped protrusions had appeared on my father's sides. They stuck out symmetrically under his shirt, 4 on the left side and 4 on the right. "Dad, you really need to go to the hospital," I said, offering him my hand. "You've got some kind of tumors." "I'm already one big tumor," my father replied, somehow managing to get to his feet. Strangely, they hadn't grown much, nor had his arms. The fat had accumulated on his neck, face, and torso, while his limbs remained the same. Something terrible was happening to him. He tried to joke, but it upset me. "This isn't funny," I said. Dad swayed, holding onto my hand. His legs bent slightly under the weight of his torso. He blinked sadly. "Son, are you going to kill me?" he asked quietly and seriously. "Kill you?" I repeated. "What nonsense. Why would I kill you?" "Because I irritate you," Dad said tearfully. "Just by living nearby, like an annoying fly. I didn't like that my old man thought I wished him harm. You're not a fly, you're my family, and I'm no killer." Sure, you're a pain, but what can you do? Thank you, son, Dad replied and dragged himself to the bathroom, leaning against the wall. The sharp protrusions on his side swayed under his shirt. Something unusual was happening to him. I'd never seen anything like it. Every day, the protrusions became more pronounced. I planned to call a doctor but hesitated, afraid they would tell me something devastating. Dad had turned into something disgusting over a few months. But he was my only family. I didn't want to lose him. I waited too long, and the irreversible happened. One day, coming home, I saw blood on the floor. It was thick and dark, like crushed cherries. A trail of large drops led to my father's room. Dad! Running to him, I tripped over something and looked down. On the threshold lay gnawed bones, large, long, unmistakably human. Nausea surged up my throat. Panic gripped me. And my father was sitting on his favorite couch, completely naked, without arms or legs. His head had merged with his torso, which was now a mass of fat folds, and between them, like tiny limbs, the cone-shaped protrusions wiggled. "What's wrong, son?" he asked, not understanding the reason for my fear. His entire face was smeared with blood. He had eaten his own arms and legs. Oh God, he really did it. I felt my sanity slipping. I wanted to sit on the floor, tear at my hair, laugh and cry at the same time. All with fear, disgust, and helplessness. My only family member, the most ordinary man, a former railroad worker, had turned into some repulsive monster. I stood frozen as a nightmare unfolded before my eyes, while I was powerless to stop. Dad fell off the couch, arched like a caterpillar, and stood on his cone-shaped legs. His body stretched almost to the ceiling. He now resembled a giant insect larva with a human face and unshaven stubble. "I'm feeling better now. Don't worry about me. I can walk again," said the thing that used to be my father. I don't know why I didn't run away immediately. Perhaps it was my mind's defense mechanism acting as if nothing had happened. The sight of the fat larva with Dad's face drove me into a panic. But I continued living with him. He crawled around the apartment like an insect, eating everything he found. Even the flies weren't lucky enough to survive. I spent all my money on food for him, fearing that in a fit of hunger, Dad might, God forbid, eat me too. After all, he'd already tasted human flesh, devouring parts of his own body. Now his bones rotted on the floor among the garbage. I couldn't bring myself to throw them away, afraid the police might show up. Our apartment turned into a dump. My room became the only clean place. I locked myself in there at night, sleeping fitfully, reacting to every noise outside the door. Dad didn't care what he ate, he just wanted more of it. I cooked massive pots of porridge from cheap grains and breadcrumbs, leaving them on the stove. Sooner or later, he'd get to them, then collapse to sleep, sprawled on the carpet, snoring. Not a man, but a sack of fat covered in skin. Not a life, but a never-ending nightmare. Almost no money left. I have to get out of here, I thought. I need to tell someone what happened. Let someone else deal with this hell. A sudden knock at the door made me flinch. No one had come to our house for a long time. I hadn't called for any couriers. I was afraid they'd see my father. I hoped the unexpected guest would just go away. But whoever was on the other side kept knocking and ringing. The noise caught my father's attention, and he rustled through the garbage piled up in his room. I thought it would be bad if he managed to unlock the door himself. So I left my room, approached the door, and quietly asked, "Who's there?" "Hello," came a cheerful voice. "This is a health inspector. Neighbors are complaining about the smell. Flies are coming out of your windows. Please open up." "Sorry, I can't," I replied, nervously rubbing my sweaty palms. "What do you mean, can't?" The man was indignant. "Should I call the police to have the door forced open?" "Fine, just a moment." I gave in quickly and turned the key in the lock with trembling fingers. Standing on the threshold was a short young man. He was wearing a gray uniform with a sanitary inspection patch and a white cap with sides bent upward. In his hands, he held a thick folder of documents. His gaze seemed cold and distrustful. "Everything's fine here," I stammered, though I could see the inspector grimacing. "I need to come in and take a look," he said sharply and squeezed into the apartment without waiting for an answer. "Wait. Something happened here, but everything will be in order soon," I tried to explain. "My God, how do you live like this?" the man whispered, glancing around. His voice was filled with surprise and disgust. "I thought, he hasn't even seen my father yet. We'd better run away before they meet. Let's go outside, I'll explain everything." I blurted out, hearing creeping sounds. "How will you explain this?" The inspector smirked, looking back at me. And at that moment, my father appeared in the doorway of his room. He bent like a worm and stretched to the ceiling. The inspector didn't even have time to glance in his direction. My father's mouth stretched to the size of a manhole. Instead of teeth, there were dozens of sharp spikes in his horrible maw. I stood frozen, watching the horrifying scene. The fat worm swallowed the inspector up to his shoulders and, with one swift motion, bit off the upper part of his torso. Detached arms flew to the sides, and the mangled body fell to the floor, spilling its insides. The inspector didn't even have time to scream. I stood there, splattered with blood, whispering in terror, "You killed him, Dad. You're a murderer." Despite the fact that my father now had a monstrous mouth instead of a face, he managed to respond, though his voice was terrifyingly distorted. "I always was. Your grandfather, he transformed. I had to kill him. You were an infant. I killed him. That's why your mother left. I killed. I had to. I had to." He kept repeating it as he slowly bent down to swallow the remaining half of the inspector's body. I could have left the apartment at any moment, but then this nightmare would have spiraled completely out of my control. Things had gone too far, and it was all my fault. Just leaving seemed impossible. I sat in the kitchen for hours, listening to the muffled chewing sounds. My father completely consumed the inspector's remains, then crawled back to his room and began snoring. There was nothing human left in him, not even his snore, which now sounded like the growl of a monstrous beast. This couldn't go on. It was time to put an end to it. I stood up and went to the kitchen cabinet where the utensils were kept. I took the biggest, sharpest knife. My pathetic face was reflected in the blade, but I was tired of being weak and cowardly. It was time to take control of my life. I walked into my father's room. My hand holding the knife was as steady as steel. My teeth clenched, my jaw tightened. The fat, gigantic worm lay on the floor, shaking with its snore like jelly. I swung the knife, plunged it into his soft flesh, and dragged it along his body. The monster woke up with a wild roar, but he couldn't move. The wound on his skin widened, and thick yellow fat poured out, smelly, sticky, revolting. My father burst open like a balloon filled with liquid. Terrified by what I had done, I dropped the knife and jumped onto the couch. The room flooded with fat. All that was left of my father were torn scraps of skin floating in this disgusting swamp. I killed him. I killed my father. I had to. Only then did I finally call the police. The interrogation was long and torturous. I told the truth about everything and didn't even hope they believed me. But the investigator said there was information in the police archives about a similar case, and it was also connected to my family. Flipping through the documents, he asked, "Do you know how your grandfather was buried?" An empty coffin was buried because there was nothing to put in it. All they found in the deceased's apartment was a swamp of fat and scraps of skin. Is this hereditary or what? You're a strange family. I knew nothing about this. My father never told me about my grandfather. He only recently admitted that he had killed him, and now he had died by my hand. I was released under house arrest and given temporary housing as a cleaning crew worked in the apartment. I stood in the shower for a long time, nervously scrubbing myself with a soapy sponge. I wanted to wash away the feeling of filth and stench. And while rubbing my body, I discovered something strange under the skin of my sides, small, hard lumps, like tiny nodules. I'd never noticed them before. I'm sure they're the beginnings of legs. That means I'll become a monster, too, when I reach maturity. The investigator was right. It's hereditary. And I'm the continuation of this endless cycle of violence, horror, and gluttony. How can I go on living, knowing this? I dried off with a towel, went to the room, and called for delivery. I ordered a large sausage pizza. I wanted to stop replaying these depressing thoughts about the future in my head. While waiting, I stared at the wall and thought about how meaningless such a life is. Whatever you do, your end will be terrible. Finally, the doorbell rang. I was delighted, grabbed the order, and started devouring the pepperoni. The oppressive thoughts seemed to quiet down a bit. I never could have imagined that I would personally encounter something so horrifying. These are the last words of my friend, who died 2 months ago under quite strange and mysterious circumstances. Actually, everything was heading toward this, starting from that ill-fated night when Mike called me and tearfully asked me to come to his home. That was exactly when it all began, yes, exactly then, on that night of the 8th of October, 2020. Only now have I decided to write about it, because the horror that happened all that time with my best friend started happening to me. I'll begin, perhaps, from the very start, precisely with that phone call I mentioned a bit earlier. It was the start of the 3rd hour of the night. I was exhausted after a hard workday and was practically seeing my 10th dream. The annoying vibration of my cell phone made me open my eyes and reach out to the nightstand. My God, why can't you sleep? I thought at that moment, glancing simultaneously at the caller's name and the time. Yes, it was then 2:11. Hello? Yeah? I mumbled sleepily. Hello, Alex? Can you hear me? My friend's frightened voice shook away my drowsiness a bit. I hear you, I muttered irritably. What happened? Do you even realize what time it is? Sorry, buddy, but I've got an urgent matter. What is it? Listen, I know this may sound stupid and ridiculous right now, but could you come over to my place? Right now? Well, yes, right now, he practically whispered in half tones. Listen, what happened? Can you explain? I'll tell you everything once you get here. All right, fine, I'm getting ready now, I said again and hung up, without listening to his thanks. I went and washed my face a bit, gathered my thoughts, threw on a tracksuit, and called a taxi. I stepped outside. It was cold. There wasn't a single star in the sky, and flashes of lightning warned that rain was approaching. I had just lit a cigarette when my eyes were hit by the bright xenon headlights of a car pulling up to the entrance. The car arrived, and the friendly, heavy-set taxi driver kindly agreed to wait for me while I finished my smoke. The cigarette but went flying into the flower bed, the car door slammed shut, and my home gradually disappeared from view. Going to Mike's doesn't take long, just about 15 minutes, even less in daytime. Now, With practically no traffic, the trip only took about 10 minutes. Mike was already standing by the entrance waiting for me, nervously lighting a cigarette from a butt. "Finally, you're here. I forgot to tell you to stop by the pharmacy on the way and give me some sedatives," Mike muttered, exhaling bitter smoke. "Well, we can go right now if you want," I replied. "Yeah, let's go. I really don't want to go back home only to leave again." "You still going somewhere?" the driver called out. Yes, please wait a second. We need the nearest pharmacy." "Get in. There's a 24-hour place not far from here." We got into the car, and the driver pulled away from the curb. "So, what happened with you?" "Come on, spill it," I asked again, repeating a question I was already tired of asking. "Don't yell at me right away, all right? Maybe you'll think I've gone off the rails, but I have this feeling that something wrong is happening in my apartment." "What do you mean?" "I mean exactly that, buddy." "What, did you watch too many horror movies or something?" I asked with a grin, but seeing my friend's genuinely terrified face, I shifted my tone, realizing he wouldn't have called me and begged me to come over for some trivial reason. "So, look," Mike pulled out his phone from his pocket and opened the gallery, where I saw a bunch of different photos of his apartment. He opened one of them and zoomed in. Unintentionally, I felt goosebumps run over my still sleepy body. In the photo was Mike's content yet not so sober face. But in addition, I noticed something else, a strange silhouette standing behind Mike, near the window. "Who's that?" I asked, surprised. Mike just gave me a bewildered look and opened the next photo. Again, that silhouette. Only this time, it was outside, on the balcony, yes, standing on the balcony, staring at the window. Mike had apparently taken the photo in the dark, making the quality extremely poor, but it was still possible to make out that there really was someone there. "I don't know who it is or where it came from in my apartment." "Here's the pharmacy," the taxi driver interrupted, pointing his finger at the glowing sign. "I'll be right back," Mike said, pulling his hood over his head and leaving the car, handing me his phone. Left alone, I continued looking at the strange photos, even allowing for the possibility that my buddy was just bored and decided to prank me by using Photoshop. But after carefully examining them, I didn't see any sign of editing. Honestly, I really wanted to find such signs because that would have quickly killed my desire to go upstairs to Mike's, let alone stay the night. My friend came out of the pharmacy and ran back to the car, simultaneously opening a pack of pills and tossing them into his mouth. He jumped in, and the driver, accompanied by the irritating clicking of the turn signal, moved off. On the way back, we stayed silent. Neither Mike nor I uttered a single word. The driver, however, kept glancing suspiciously at us in the rearview mirror, probably having overheard his story and thinking he was some kind of nutcase. Nevertheless, he got us back, and after settling up, we left the car. The rain seemed only to be getting stronger and was on the verge of turning into a downpour. "I haven't told you everything yet," Mike suddenly said. "I didn't want to mention it in front of a stranger. So that's why you stayed quiet the whole ride. Among other reasons. Are we going to stand out here, or should we go inside?" he muttered somewhat irritably. "Yeah, let's go." Mike went in first. Entering the building, I followed, and as we climbed the stairs, he continued his story. "Those photos were everything. Whoever that is in the pictures. Yeah, who is that?" I interrupted. "I don't know who that is, but as soon as it realized it had been noticed, it started giving itself away, terrifying me beyond belief. I wouldn't have called you if it was just the photos. I'd have made it through one night somehow and figured something out tomorrow. Although, come on, even the photos aren't exactly trivial, you know? Compared to what happened next, trust me, they're minor," Mike said, turning the key in the lock. We entered the dark apartment, which was instantly flooded with light after a flick of the switch. That same evening, I started noticing random things lying on the floor. In general, objects ended up completely different from where I had placed them. Maybe you forgot? You know how my memory is. It'd be one thing if it was just one object, he said. What do you think? I don't know what to think. Feels like something has made a home in my apartment, and I'll tell you, buddy, I'm downright scared to stay here alone. Well, there you go. You say you could handle it alone, I teased, trying in any way to lighten the mood. Maybe I should call a priest? Let him say prayers and put up crucifixes. We'll try tomorrow, but tonight, we still have to make it through. I hope you're not planning to go home, right? Mike gave me those big, pleading eyes, like the cat from Shrek. Where am I supposed to go? It's pouring out there. Plus, you're not in great shape. I'm not leaving you. Thanks, buddy, he said, rushing over to give me a tight hug. Honestly, I had never seen him like this before, so scared and, at the same time, so relieved I didn't leave him alone in his own apartment. The clock's hands slowly passed the 4 o'clock mark, and it wasn't getting light out at all. We sat in the kitchen, drinking coffee with cookies, talking, smoking, and, without realizing it, fell asleep right there at the kitchen table. Suddenly, lightning struck somewhere very close, out in the yard, and was followed by loud thunder and the blaring of car alarms. The noise practically yanked me from my slumber. Darkness still reigned. Rubbing my eyes, I looked around the kitchen again and didn't see my friend nearby. Startled, I called out, "Mike? Mike!" Whatever drowsiness I had was gone. Turning on the kitchen light, I walked into the hallway and flipped the switch there. "Where are you?" I muttered. Then I saw him. Mike was lying there, asleep, near the closet at the other end of the hallway. I rushed over, woke him up, and he looked at me with bewildered eyes, as though seeing me for the first time. "What are you doing here?" "I don't know." "You and I fell asleep together in the kitchen, right? Or did we not?" "It looks like we did." "Yeah, come on, wake up." He sat there as if entranced. I dreamed someone was dragging me away, but I didn't see who or where. Apparently, they brought me here. Sleepwalking. "My God, stand up," I said, offering him my hand. We went back to the kitchen, only this time we didn't sleep. The clock was already showing the beginning of the 6th hour of the morning, but black clouds prevented the sun's rays from hitting the ground. Rain was still coming down, flooding everything around us. At that time, I considered the possibility that my friend was the one who somehow made his way there in his sleep, but I changed my mind the moment I picked up my phone. It had been on the kitchen table all night. I simply wanted to check the time, so I unlocked it and saw the camera still running, plus a small icon indicating there were new photos. I opened them and dropped the phone, staring at Mike with wide eyes. A cold sweat immediately broke out on my forehead, and I stood there, paralyzed, trying to make sense of what I had just seen on my phone. They were photos of Mike and me, photos of us sleeping in the kitchen taken at 5 in the morning, as if someone had photographed us from the window, from on top of the fridge. The horror that washed over me at that moment defies description. "Mike, the front door was locked all night, right?" "Yeah, I always lock every latch, especially these days." With difficulty, I picked up my phone again. "Look at this," I said, showing Mike the photos. He, in turn, backed away in shock, covering his mouth with his hand. Now I was truly scared. I couldn't find an explanation for what had happened. I tried somehow to attribute this to someone having broken in. But no, logic and common sense just couldn't win here. The door really was locked from the inside, and no one had opened it. We saw no sign of an intruder in the apartment, and certainly nobody could have climbed in through the window because we were on the 4th floor. Without wasting a minute, we quickly got ready, composed ourselves, and left the apartment. "So, what do we do now?" Mike asked with trembling hands while lighting in another cigarette. "We need to go to a church, I think, tell them what's going on. Let the priest bless the place. Hopefully it'll help. And if it doesn't?" All I could do was shrug in silence and pull out my phone to call a taxi. In the end, we drove to the first church we came across. We met with a priest, a very kind, sympathetic older fellow, or so he seemed at first. He listened to us and agreed to help, writing down Mike's address. He asked us to leave because he had a wedding ceremony to conduct. He said he'll come at 4, Mike muttered. "What do we do till then?" "We're definitely not going back to your place." "I'm not going home either." "Nobody's talking about going home. Let's go to my place." We spent the whole time sitting in my kitchen, trying to construct theories and find a logical explanation for everything that had happened. Neither Mike nor I could come up with anything. While looking at him, I kept getting the feeling he was holding something back. The rain continued to pour down, sometimes getting stronger, sometimes weaker, but either way, the weather made it unappealing to go out. Still, the clock's hand was racing toward 4, so we had to head out. Mike reluctantly got ready and walked out after me. The priest was already waiting for us at the entrance with a small bag over his shoulder. "Hello again. Sorry we're late." "You can go on in, let's see what you've got going on," he said almost in a whisper. We slowly climbed to the apartment, and Mike opened the door, letting the priest go in first. "You guys haven't cleaned up, I see." "Understandable, you're young," the priest smiled. But Mike and I stood frozen on the threshold, staring at the chaos all over the apartment. A chaos that hadn't been there in the morning. Everything was scattered across the floor, broken dishes in the kitchen, crumpled clothes smeared with something, broken stools, and other damaged furniture. I can't even describe the dread that consumed me in those moments. The priest was already pulling items out of his bag, while we stood there in shock, overwhelmed by what we were seeing. Soon, we heard prayers from the next room, and trying to pull ourselves together, we followed him. The entire procedure took about an hour. The priest went through each room, prayed, sprinkled holy water on the walls, and put little crucifixes on them. After finishing, he came up to us and said, "Guys, it's very heavy in here. The aura in this apartment is terrible. The Lord will help you, he will, for sure." He crossed us both in turn. We paid him, and he left. I had the feeling he'd rushed through everything just so he could get away from there. When he said the apartment was bad, you could see that sentiment written plainly on his face. Real nightmares began that same evening, once the sun went down. I spent the day helping Mike clean up the mess caused by that unknown force in his apartment, but honestly, it felt genuinely oppressive to be in there. Mike looked just as bad. He barely spoke, just silently and mechanically swept up the debris into garbage bags. "Mike, maybe have a drink? You look exhausted." "No, I don't want anything," he snapped. He hadn't eaten either. "Come on, let's grab something to eat." "I've got nothing," he said. "Let me see," I replied, heading to the kitchen. Opening the fridge, I was immediately hit with the stench of spoiled food. Although there wasn't much in there, every vegetable had rotted, a small piece of cooked meat had turned green, the bread was moldy. "Mike, everything here is spoiled," I called out. He rushed into the kitchen. "Spoiled?" 3 days ago, I stocked up. Once again, goosebumps involuntarily ran across my skin. "You know, nothing surprises me anymore," he said dejectedly and trudged to the living room, sat down on the couch, and buried his head in his hands. "It seems to me that nothing changed after the priest came," I still feel someone else is here besides us, he murmured. No, I think it's fine now. Then take your phone and walk around the apartment, take some pictures, and that's it. No problem, I said. I pulled out my phone from my pocket, turned on the camera, and walked from the hallway to the kitchen, from the kitchen to the other room, then out to the balcony. After taking a bunch of pictures, I went back and sat next to Mike. Okay, look, I said, showing him photos of his apartment. Nobody's here. I was still smiling, but not for long. Mike grabbed the phone from my hands and turned up the brightness. My smile vanished in an instant. In every photo, there was a figure, barely visible due to the darkness and my phone's outdated camera. It resembled a person, at least in the sense that it had 2 arms, 2 legs, and a head. But right away, the head looked odd, too small, maybe, and bald. It seemed like it was just a skull. As for the body, I couldn't make it out, as it blended in with the darkness in the rooms. And in every single picture, it was never fully visible. It seemed to be hiding, behind a curtain, behind a door, in the hallway. I wanted to run from there as fast as I could, with no further proof needed of whatever was haunting that place. But Mike hadn't finished scrolling yet. On my way back to the living room, I decided to take a selfie in the mirror. Mike got to that photo, and the phone fell out of his hands. I jumped up, fear gripping me like an animal. In the mirror's reflection, besides me holding the phone, there was one more thing, standing right behind me. It wasn't human, but something horrifying, almost pressed up against me, peering over my shoulder. A skull, covered with paper-white skin, with hideous holes where its eyes, nose, and mouth should be, as though someone had gouged them out with a metal rod. Again, the body wasn't fully visible because it was behind me, but I could see part of it, black rags, from which emerged a very human-like arm that looked ready to land on my shoulder. Panic slammed into our heads like an iron hammer. We got dressed as fast as possible and tried to dash out of the apartment, but the front door was locked. Mike, where's the key? I always leave it on the little table by the mirror. It's not here. Is there a spare? No. I lost it 2 years ago at a club. Where is it? Where is it? Mike was panicking, tossing around papers, receipts, and other documents he neatly stacked by the mirror just a moment ago. After several minutes of searching, we failed to find the key, and soon we were back on the couch, wondering what to do. Do you have a rope, Mike? You want to climb down from the window? We're on the 4th floor, seriously? Count me out. I'm terrified of heights, he said. How about calling a locksmith? Yes, let's try that. Mike grabbed his phone and started searching for numbers. It's almost night. Think someone will agree to come? I asked. I don't care. I'll pay anything, as long as I can get out of here. I can't stay here anymore. He managed to get through to someone, and about half an hour later, during which I overheard part of the conversation, the person agreed to come help, but would take at least an hour, living on the other side of Riverside. Mike even offered to pay for his taxi. After hanging up, silence enveloped us, a silence like in a graveyard, where we could even hear the second hand of the clock. Something's not right, Mike. You feel it, too? Almost immediately after my question, the table near the window literally flew up into the air and then crashed down on the other side, breaking in half. I yelped and jumped. The chairs followed. This time, they flew in our direction. One zoomed past me, thankfully as I ducked. The second one slammed into my arm, which I've raised to shield myself. I fell to the floor, grabbing my arm and screaming, the pain indescribable. Mike shouted and ran toward me. Suddenly, the lights in the apartment went out, and not just switched off, the bulbs began to explode. What the hell is happening? I growled through gritted teeth, still clutching my arm. I don't know, he trailed off, sniffing the air. I smelled it, too, faintly like burning. Looking around the room, I saw the crucifixes the priest had placed on the walls start to smolder, as if about to burst into flame. Unable to stand it any longer, I got to my feet and ran to the entryway. With all my might, I kicked the door in hopes of busting it down, but it was incredibly sturdy, and I only ended up hurting my leg. Mike didn't hesitate. He grabbed me under the arms and dragged me to the bathroom, locking the door and barricading it with a small cabinet. We stayed in there for a very long time, each passing second feeling like hours. Time dragged on painfully slowly. Sitting in that bathroom, we repeatedly heard strange noises outside the door, footsteps, even. We stayed completely quiet, barely daring to breathe, waiting for a knock, waiting for the locksmith to arrive and open the lock, finally letting us out of this hell, without you. Even now, I remember that stepping on the first, second, seventh, and eighth steps was strictly forbidden. The left side was reserved for the chosen ones. The entrance also had a mirrored outdoor staircase on the opposite side. It would be more accurate to call it symmetrical, but I never used the right side. Therefore, in my memory, the right side is rudimentary, it simply doesn't exist. There, something strange prevails, obeying the laws of geometry, with an illogical drop-off instead of proper steps leading down. Perhaps that part became what it was after a boy from our courtyard stepped on the eighth step, and one of the older kids grabbed him by the scruff and dragged him down. This act, in its essence, was purely ritualistic, much like how in Sparta they would toss sickly infants off cliffs. That's how he was sent away, never to return. From that day on, I avoided the right side, even after the club closed and a stationery store took its place. I first learned about the console club Mortal Kombat when I was 7 years old. The first time I saw it was while sitting in a barber's chair. It seems the establishment's name hinted at something magical, sorceress, or fairy tale. Inside, there were 2 rooms. On the left was the console club with a small sign featuring a dragon and the letters M and K, and on the right was the barber shop itself. Sitting in the chair on an extra wooden board, I saw crowds of kids going inside. They all took off their shoes and disappeared into the darkness of the room, from which mesmerizing sounds emanated. In front of me were only dozens of pairs of shoes, scattered just beyond the club's threshold. A year later, I went there with my courtyard friends and learned the main rules: never step on the first, second, seventh, or eighth steps, never enter the club with shoes on, and, most importantly, under no circumstances, never play with the redhead. While the third rule was straightforward, I understood the first 2 through an illustrative example. A boy from our courtyard was dragged down the right side of the staircase by the older kids. The second and eighth steps were occupied by those who stepped outside for a smoke break. The second step belonged to the younger kids, who would spit down onto the first. The eighth was for the older ones, who, while smoking, spat on the seventh. But why, no matter what, one couldn't play with the redhead, I couldn't understand. Moreover, for a long time, I was genuinely curious, who was this redhead? The other older boys, those who borrowed coins, taught how to play properly, or grabbed a joystick to show off a trick or 2, I remembered instantly, by face and by name. What puzzled me was that in over a year of going there, I had never seen anyone red-headed. You know how it goes, everything seems normal, absolutely nothing happens. You get to know people from the club, and others remember you. Someone from the older kids is even willing to stand up for you when an outsider gives you trouble. The console club becomes a second home with its own vibrant life. Sometimes, when there were very few people, Aunt Grace wouldn't always demand you stop playing. If the club had only one regular at a time, she would rarely leave her little booth, reading yet another bland detective novel or quietly napping. A huge chunk of those memories is filled with an inexpressible warmth. All those moments when someone's socks inevitably reeked and they would sit wearing plastic bags bought from the nearest kiosk. All those jokes from the older kids, like, "Whoa, kid, what pedals you got there?" or "Let's draw a Nike logo on the side for you." I think there was even a guy who ended up getting a Nike swoosh drawn on his bags with a marker. It seemed the older kids jokingly got offended when, as he left, he took them off before putting his shoes back on. "Kid, you just threw away such awesome sneakers, the newest collection." There was a boy who, while playing Sonic, had an epileptic seizure and knocked the Sega console off the stool it stood on. I remember the network of extension cords and wires in front of the dozen TVs came alive for a moment. The boy was from a poor family. A little more, and the interconnected web of cords and TVs might have toppled over like dominoes. The boy was lucky enough to encounter Aunt Grace's substitute, who was considered the club's bad cop. When he came to, the angry substitute scolded him for a long time, threatening that if he broke anything, his parents would be paying them back for life. At the end of her speech, she outright banned him from coming back to the club. The boy just left. Several times, there were moments when some kids' moms or dads stormed into the club, shouting, "So this is where you've been, you little brat," dragging their kids out by the ears. Then, like vultures, someone would immediately grab the dropped joystick and finish the remaining time with primal ferocity. As autumn approached, the older kids would bring cheap booze and come into the club just to warm up. The large glass window to the left of the entrance would fog up quickly, and those waiting for their turn would leave finger-written messages, things like "Nix, a loser who got fat on fleas, sat on the bench and croaked," or "Shot Tars the champion." On the side, someone scribbled, "Diving into a cauldron," and "Whoever listens to Bon Jovi dresses like a transvestite." Only one inscription wasn't defaced with some joke. "Redhead." It stood apart from the rest, as if the finger that wrote it was smeared in some kind of grime. After an hour, the windows would look as if they had been doused with water. Most of the funny messages were erased by streaks of condensation. Only one inscription remained legible, "Redhead." You could still see it a week later. The dirty smudges never disappeared. Aunt Grace tried more than once to wipe it off. Her rag didn't work. Even accompanying cursing had no effect. We simply tried not to look at it until the writing finally faded away. I have many mixed memories that I probably can't arrange chronologically. Some are from summer, others from spring. They all generally cover the period of my first 3 years in school and some seasonal holidays. I remember how, during that short time, several generations of Mortal Kombat Club regulars came and went. By the time I was in 5th grade, no one smoked on the steps anymore. None of the newcomers knew the rules. Everyone stepped on the 1st, 2nd, 7th, and 8th steps, and you could enter the club with shoes on. No one but me remembered that, no matter what, you must never play with the redhead. At the same time, the city experienced a boom in computer clubs, and console clubs were gradually dying out. The queues at Mortal Kombat disappeared. No one crowded at the entrance or outside, no one gave advice on how and what to play, and no one suggested a match in Street Racer. They all vanished, migrating to computer clubs, where they were reborn in a new, more complex form. But for some reason, I continued to regularly visit Mortal Kombat and play on the Dendy or Sega, even though by that time I already had a Sony console at home. Neither my parents nor my friends from the yard could understand this, by the way. Starting in 3rd grade, my academic performance began to plummet, and it was only by some miracle that I wasn't held back a year. Teachers convinced my parents that I was falling behind developmentally and suggested transferring me to a special class. Everyone in my class found out about this, which made me feel especially miserable. Even in moments during lessons when I knew the answer, I refrained from speaking up so my classmates wouldn't see that I cared, that I was putting in effort, or that I was trying to become one of them. Somewhere around 5th grade, I started skipping school and spent my time in Mortal Kombat, sitting in complete solitude and silence, playing my favorite games until the end of school hours. At school, teachers often called me out in front of the entire class, saying I wouldn't even be able to get a job as a janitor. I had no desire to go there anymore. Around that same September, one less TV appeared in the club, and a week later, there were only 5 left. I remember watching the club vanish before my eyes. Chairs and stands were taken away, posters were removed from the walls, and everything was dismantled, even the booth where Aunt Grace always sat. All that remained was one TV connected to a Sega. It seemed like it was the end of October, maybe even the 31st, though I can't remember for sure. That morning, my homeroom teacher announced that she had called my father to the school. She said she couldn't tolerate my truancy anymore. This meant that they would suggest to my father that he withdraw my school records. I had a nasty feeling in my gut, the closure of my beloved club, my unwillingness to go to school, the skipping, and the impending consequences. I felt so awful and heavy inside that I simply couldn't bear it anymore. I grabbed my things and left after the first lesson. I went straight to Mortal Kombat, knowing it was their last day. As always, following a now unnecessary rule, I avoided stepping on certain steps. Inside the club, there was no one. On one stand, there was a TV showing the news. On the floor lay several overstuffed bags. The only person there was Aunt Grace. She was filling out some paperwork and listing the contents of the bags. According to her, someone would arrive in an hour to take down the sign above the entrance. After that, the Mortal Kombat Club would cease to exist forever. She was surprised to see me and, out of some kind of irritation, said that she had already packed all the cartridges. Seeing my confusion, Aunt Grace seemed even more deflated. I don't know what she was feeling at that moment. Maybe the same as I was. After looking at me for a bit, she faintly smiled and rummaged in a bag. She pulled out a Sega wrapped in cords and connected it to the TV. Then something else miraculous happened. She pulled out a cartridge with a green little man wearing a black bandana. I couldn't believe my eyes. Boo German. I was so overjoyed I could hardly breathe. Aunt Grace noticed and said I could play for another hour until they came to take down the sign. She needed to step out for 10 minutes and asked me to watch over everything. She said something else, but I was so happy I barely heard her. Familiar music played as the green man crawled out of a toilet. Behind me, the bell of the entrance door jingled, and Aunt Grace left. Even now, I can recall my thoughts in detail, how I wished the hour she gave me would never end. I just wanted to be there. I wanted time to stop or disappear entirely. I didn't want to go home and face a new day with classmates who always had their homework done and studied effortlessly. I didn't want to listen to my parents' arguments at home or hear their discussions about my future. I knew that because of my truancy, my parents would most likely be asked to withdraw my school records. My homeroom teacher had mentioned it more than once. All of this together made me experience every pixel on the screen as if it were the last in my life. I think I didn't even press start. I just sat in front of the TV, blankly staring at the screen. Then the screen went dark for a moment, and I noticed a silhouette standing behind me. It was a boy in a cap who looked a few years older than me. He immediately introduced himself. His name was Matthew. With a touch of frustration, he said, "Damn, I love this game. Looks like it froze." Then he approached the Sega, removed the cartridge, blew on it, and reinserted it. Still, nothing happened. The boy took off his cap, scratched his blonde head, and put the cap back on. "Hey, I know. Want me to show you the coolest game in the world?" he said, reaching into his jacket pocket. In his hands appeared a Sega cartridge that looked very different from the ones I had seen before. It was metallic, with a name that seemed to consist of welding seams, no words, just a complex symbol with intersecting lines. Now you're gonna freak out. This is the coolest game in history, I swear. Watch. On the TV screen, a flashing Sega logo appeared, and then it began to slowly crawl downward, blinking until it disappeared. For a second, it seemed to me that it crawled out of the TV and started moving along the floor. I glanced down, but just then, Matthew enthusiastically shouted again. Press start. There was no intro screen, no music, just a black inscription, start, on a white background. After hesitating for a moment, I pressed it, and the game began. Black and white clouds appeared on the TV screen. They moved very slowly and seemed to darken. Then a lightning bolt flashed on the screen, thunder roared, and it started to rain. At that exact moment, the same thing happened outside the window. The sky darkened, a flash of lightning, and thunder followed by rain. Look! It's gonna get even cooler. Right after the intro, a boy appeared on the screen, standing on the street. Visually, as far as pixels allowed, he looked suspiciously like Matthew. Around him were houses, pedestrians walking, and cars driving by. Seeing him, Matthew immediately lit up and asked, "Hand over the joystick, I'll show you a trick." Taking the joystick, he entered a combination of buttons, causing the boy on the screen to fly through several levels downward. When he landed, Matthew handed me the joystick and said, "So, what do you think?" What was happening on the screen seemed eerily familiar. This pixelated boy was near a kid sitting in front of the TV, a kid in whom I began to recognize myself. What I saw didn't fit into my head. Take it, try it. There are so many cool tricks. Look, grab the one in the corner on the right. Do you see the joystick there? That's a secret. The pixelated guy on the screen had a clearly visible red head. I remember being really scared. Something in my head just flipped, and I involuntarily started glancing at Matthew, who was sitting to my right, at his hair. It wasn't red, but I was still terrified. I don't want to. Matthew laughed, took the joystick from my hands. The little guy on the screen perked up, ran to the corner of the room, and picked up the secret joystick. After that, Matthew stood up, yanked out the cartridge, quickly shoved it into his pocket, and said, "Don't freak out. Let's just go to my place. I've got a notebook at home with tons of cool combos. I'll give it to you." To me? Yeah, I don't mind. What kind of combos? I'll show you outside. Promise you won't regret it. Let's go. I'll wait outside. Saying this, Matthew darted out the door. A minute later, Aunt Grace came in. She'd gotten soaked in the rain. She had no time for me. I tried to say goodbye to her in a formal way. The Mortal Kombat Club meant a lot to me, but there was no dramatic farewell. She thanked me, then immediately began disconnecting the console and stuffing it into one of her bags. In the hallway above the entrance, the sign was already being taken down. As I stepped out the door, I looked back one last time and realized the Mortal Kombat Club had just died before my eyes. "Oh, there you are. What took you so long? Let's go." Matthew was standing under the awning outside, right by the entrance. I'd rather go home, especially since it's raining. I didn't really feel like going with him. "Come on. Why bother going home?" he said, pulling the joystick out of his pocket. "Look." He started pressing long combinations on the joystick again, and then, in an instant, the rain stopped. "Well?" he asked, pleased with himself. "Ow. What is this? Is this you? Who else? Let's go with me. I'll show you even more tricks. I've got a whole notebook at home, and I'll give it to you. Why go home? We'll hang out, then crash at my place. I've got tons of cartridges and a really rare console that's even cooler than a PlayStation. I was stunned by his manipulation with the joystick, and after wrestling with myself a bit, I agreed. My place isn't far from here. But we won't go straight there. We'll wait a couple more hours until it's dark. For now, let's head to the bus stop and have some fun. At the bus stop, there was a crowd of people. Matthew seemed to be looking for someone specific, then said, "Hey, check out that old man with the yellow bag." At the same time, he pulled the joystick out of his pocket and started entering another combination. The old man walked a few steps, and then his bag ripped, and 3 tomatoes rolled onto the ground. Matthew burst out laughing and said, "That's not all." Then he pressed another combination. As soon as he finished, the tomatoes turned into little red balls. The old man stared at them in confusion, turning them over in his hands, trying to figure out what they were. Matthew laughed again. Next, he focused on a plump woman with a brown purse. "Watch this, you're gonna die laughing." Another combination on the joystick. The woman instantly screamed and flung the now moving purse away from herself. A dozen people noticed this, and one brave soul approached the purse, picked it up, and slowly opened it. He almost immediately jumped back. A chicken flew out of the purse, feathers scattering everywhere. The woman, the purse's owner, shrieked in surprise, which sent Matthew into hysterical laughter. "Oh, see that girl with the stroller? This one's gonna be tricky." Matthew started punching in some mysterious combination again, then froze and stared at the girl. She was rocking the stroller and looking out for the tram, paying no attention to her child. Matthew even frowned and repeated the long combo. Then, an inhuman scream echoed down the street. "Where's my baby? My baby?" People started gathering around the girl and peering into the stroller. They looked, frowned, and then walked away, giving her a wide berth. "Let's go take a look too," said Matthew, heading toward the stroller. He reached it long before I did, glanced inside, and immediately began smiling, occasionally looking in my direction. I admit, I was expecting to see anything in there but an ordinary doll. Inside was a plastic baby doll, gripping the stroller. The girl was gasping for air in pure terror. She couldn't speak or scream anymore. Matthew pulled me away by the arm. A deep feeling of unease began to grow inside me. I think I understood everything back then. And when he let go of me, I deliberately kept following him. The longer I walked behind him, the more eerie and twisted his combinations became. "Look, do you see the woman in the window? Watch this." Another sequence of combinations. Behind the woman, a dark silhouette appeared. It stood behind her as she continued to look out at the street. Then it grabbed her and pulled her into the depths of the apartment. Only the curtains swayed for a few seconds in the window. Noticing my frightened reaction, Matthew decided that wasn't enough. He performed another combo, and where there had been a window, there was now a solid brick wall. We passed by some kind of monument. He pulled out his joystick, did his manipulations, and muffled moans began emanating from within the monument. And I kept following him, afraid to say a word. "I think I'll just go home, especially since it's raining," I said. Somehow, I didn't feel like going with him. "Come on, what's the point of going home?" he said, pulling the joystick out of his pocket. "Look." He started pressing a long series of combinations on the joystick, and then, in a single second, the rain stopped. "Well, how's that?" he asked, clearly pleased with himself. "How is this even possible? Is that you?" "Yeah, who else? Come with me. I'll show you so many cool things. I even have a whole notebook of tricks, I'll give it to you. What's the point of going home? Let's hang out, then we can crash at my place. I've got tons of cartridges and even a super rare console that's cooler than a PlayStation. I was amazed by his manipulation with the joystick, and after wrestling with myself a bit, I agreed. Alright, I live nearby, but we won't go straight to my place. Let's wait a couple of hours until it's dark, and in the meantime, let's go to the bus stop, have some fun. At the bus stop, there was a crowd of people. Matthew seemed to be looking for someone in particular, then said, "See that old guy with the yellow bag? Watch this." At the same time, he pulled the joystick from his pocket and started pressing some combination again. The old man took a few steps, and then his bag tore, with 3 tomatoes bouncing onto the ground. Matthew burst into laughter and said, "That's not all." Then he pressed another combo. As soon as he finished, the tomatoes turned into small red balls. The old man looked at the balls in confusion, turning them in his hands as he tried to figure out what they were. Matthew laughed again. Next, he focused his gaze on a plump woman with a brown handbag. "Watch this. You're going to die laughing." He pressed another combo on the joystick, and the woman immediately squealed and tossed her writhing bag away. A dozen people turned to look, and one brave soul approached the bag, picked it up, and began to open it slowly. He almost instantly recoiled. A feather-fluffing chicken flew out of the bag. The woman was so stunned she could barely breathe, and Matthew was absolutely delighted. "Oh, see that girl with the stroller? This is going to be a tough combo." Matthew started another intricate sequence on the joystick, then froze and stared at the girl. She was rocking the stroller and glancing around for a tram, paying no attention to her child. Matthew even furrowed his brow as he repeated the long combo. Suddenly, an inhuman scream erupted across the street. "Where's my baby? My baby!" People began approaching the girl and peering into the stroller. They looked, frowned, and then conspicuously avoided her. "Let's go see too," Matthew said, heading toward the stroller. He reached it far ahead of me, looked inside, and immediately began smiling, glancing at me from time to time. I admit, I expected to see anything but what was actually there. Inside was an ordinary plastic baby doll clinging to the stroller. The girl was hyperventilating from sheer panic. She couldn't speak or scream anymore. From there, Matthew pulled me by the hand. A very unsettling feeling began to grow inside me. I think I understood everything back then. And when he let me go, I deliberately continued to follow him. The longer I followed him, the more horrific and twisted his combos became. "See that woman in the window? Check this out." Another combo. A dark silhouette appeared behind the woman. It stood there as she continued to look out at the street. Then, he grabbed her and dragged her into the depths of the apartment. The curtains swayed in the window for a few seconds. Noticing my terrified reaction, Matthew decided that wasn't enough. He performed another combo, and where there had been a window, there was now a solid brick wall. We passed by some kind of monument. He pulled out his joystick, did his manipulations, and muffled moans began emanating from within the monument. And I kept following and following him, afraid to say a word. Before long, we were far from the city center and had moved into the residential districts. It was getting dark, and as the sun set, Matthew grew silent. He occasionally muttered, "Soon we'll be able to go to my place." But he said it as if afraid to forget or perhaps to reassure himself. Along the way, I heard him pressing another combo on his joystick, but nothing happened when he finished. He walked ahead of me. In the dim light, his hair started to look unnaturally bright, and then he pressed another combo, and it returned to normal. "A little more, it's already close." At times, his voice became rasping, and his steps shuffling. Then he would pull out the joystick again. And then I felt a worldly stench. Matthew tried to move faster. His fading voice repeated, "Let's go to my place. It's just a bit further, to my house." The stench grew more unbearable, and his speech dissolved into a chaotic stream of gurgling. And then we finally arrived. It seemed to be the end of a 4-story, unfinished brick building. Matthew suggested that I go down, but I refused. The open door led to a tiny, shallow, semi-basement room. A powerful stench of rot hit my nostrils. Matthew stood with his back to me to the right of the door, constantly turning away. He tried not to look there because he knew what was there. And then I saw it too. There lay a body. A tiny, decayed body with an unnaturally red head. There are all the combinations," he muttered. "Not in the notebook. Take it, and the joystick is yours. Go in, it's right there, to the side. It's yours." Matthew's head under his cap began to redden again, and his legs buckled. He was falling apart before my eyes. "Go in there. Take it. There's the notebook with all the combinations. It's yours now," he said. And I kept seeing how he pressed his buttons harder and harder. He barely had the strength to push. And then his whole body simply went limp, and the joystick, along with chunks of flesh and belongings, fell downward. Only then did I see where the wire from the joystick led. Under the clothes, it went into his body, into his insides. And for every one of his tricks, the redhead spent a piece of himself until there was nothing left of him. And only then did I understand why he actually needed me. That incomprehensible black mass in the room on which the decayed body with red hair lay wasn't trash and dirt. It was someone's bodies, which it fed on. Along with this, I noticed something else inside the small room. There was a sign from the console club Mortal Kombat. The dragon with the letters Mortal Kombat. It lay behind the body with red hair and looked like a gravestone. With my foot, I sent the joystick lying at the entrance over there. It landed near the redhead. As soon as it ended up there, the doorway began to close up until a brick wall appeared before my eyes. It's hard to remember how I made my way back. And there wasn't anything good waiting for me at home either. Until the very end of school, I was still the worst in the class. However, deep down, I believe that on that day, life arranged its personal test, which, fortunately, I didn't fail. And the rest somehow didn't matter anymore. I don't think anyone would be interested in reading about who I work as now or what miracle keeps me alive to this day. After all, several times I tried to find that place, and I can't even answer myself why. All that remains from that time is the barber shop, where I still get my hair cut to this day. It's still there, next to the stationery store, which is located where the Mortal Kombat Club used to be. The beat still plays. I climb the left side. I still step over the first, second, seventh, and eighth steps.